Mormon Equity, a power struggle. I was interested to learn during these past few weeks of a talk given at BYU, at my alma mater, on the topic of iniquity and equity in the Book of Mormon. And what is just as interesting as the talk is the pushback that is happening from LDS apologists and their current Orthodox media. So I've spent some time listening to both sides, trying to see what their arguments are and where I fit into all this. The talk was given by Dr. Eduardo Pagan, a visiting professor from ASU and a member of the LDS Church. It was hosted on campus by the BYU College of Family, Home, and Social Sciences on October 12th. According to attendees, there appeared to be several hundred students and faculty there, so many people that there were people standing in the back and even sitting in the aisles. The title of the talk was What the Book of Mormon Says About Equity and Inclusion. I couldn't find the whole talk available online, but I will quote parts of it from a response article written by Eliza Anderson in the BYU Cougar Chronicle that I think are quite interesting. So here she goes. She wrote, Dr. Pagan's presentation was centered on his findings and the conclusions he has come to in reading and interpreting the Book of Mormon through the lens of equity and inclusion. He said, what I want to share with you is my deep reading of the Book of Mormon and one of the key messages that I believe is embedded in the text. He began by pointing out how, according to his count, the word equity is used about 111 times in the Book of Mormon, and that it is used far more than the related words such as abomination and wickedness. He continued, I'm a believer that no words are by accident in our sacred scripture. All of them are quite intentional. He then said, in the modern world, we Americans tend to see terms like abomination, wickedness, and iniquity as all synonyms for sin. I want to suggest to you that they are all actually addressing different kinds of wrong behavior. So far, I agree with this guy 100%. Okay. Dr. Pagan's next addressed the definitions of the word iniquity. He referenced the Oxford English Dictionary, quote, the quality of being unrighteous or more often unrighteous action or conduct, sometimes, especially in early use, wrongful or injurious action towards another, infliction of wrong or injury, in modern use generally connoting gross injustice or public wrong. He went on to also mention the Latin root of the word iniquity, stating, quote, in fact, the term iniquity comes from the Latin term iniquus, which means unequal or unjust. So when you see that term, and as you study the Book of Mormon, I want you to think about what ways it is referring to unjust behavior or unjust action. All right, this was especially interesting to me personally because over half a year ago, as I studied the word iniquity, I found the same etymology that Dr. Pagan discovered. I made a video called Mormon Equity, in which I said, iniquity is mentioned some 227 times in the Book of Mormon. I had always just assumed it was a synonym for the word sin, a catch-all word that means anything bad. But being a person fascinated with languages, I got a harebrained idea to research the word. So I looked it up in several dictionaries, and then on sites dedicated to the word etymology. And what I found really surprised me. I learned that the word iniquity came to the English through French from the Latin root word iniquitatem, whose definition is unequalness, unevenness, or unjust, unequal, slanting, or steep. How amazing that now, many months later, I learn of a talk at BYU where another professor has independently come to the same realization that I did. That's kind of cool. Okay, continuing on with Eliza Anderson's article. Throughout the rest of his presentation, he equated the word iniquity with the word inequity. Okay, so this is where things get interesting. Continuing on, according to Dr. Pagan's reading of the Book of Mormon, every time the ancient Book of Mormon prophets were talking about iniquity, they are really saying something about inequity, and not an inequity that can be understood as an imbalance in the scales of justice directly resulting from one's iniquitous act, but inequity as we see it defined in today's political climate and in our modern cultural pursuit of the all-important diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI. So pause here for a second. Right here is where Dr. Pagan and I part ways. I concluded from my studies that iniquity means unevenness and unequalness. Dr. Pagan is using the current buzzword inequity, which is a loaded word in today's political climate. A problem I see here is that I believe that the meanings of both words, iniquity and inequity, which started off from the same Latin root of uneven and unequal, were both altered to benefit certain groups in power. I believe the word iniquity was altered by churches to be confused with the catch-all word sin in order to hide the leader's own usurpation of power and authority. And I believe that the word inequity is being altered currently by certain parties from unequal to a cover word for excusing inequality. And I'll talk more about this in a few minutes. All right, continuing on with the article. Dr. Pagan said, now, here is one other layer I want to share with you. It was the notion of restricted governance and the systems of power and privilege that existed in the Nephite nation. What I find interesting is that if you were a native of Zarahemlan, your nation is controlled by a minority population, a foreign population. They speak a different language, have a different religion, different culture, different economy. So their language, their identity, their religion, all of it had been imposed upon them. And I wonder if this was an underlying cause of resentment. When we see the history then of rising factions, revolts, challenges to power and authority, they all have the appearance, to me at least, as rebellions against inequity and domination as well. Okay, so that word rebellions, I believe, was an intentional word here that Dr. Pagan used. In a very nice flowery language, he is planting a seed. He is differentiating between the restricted, oppressive governance of the Nephites and the necessary rebellions of non-Nephites, those who were not in power. So fascinating. Continuing on with the article, Dr. Pagan said, so to this question of why did the Nephite nation fail? This is one of the messages that I find in the Book of Mormon. It's that the practice of concentrating wealth and privilege and limiting leadership and undermining national unity, the structural inequalities between the wealthy and the powerful and the dispossessed brings resentment, rebellion, here's that word again, and defections. This question about what Mormon has to say on the question of equity and inclusion, I believe that it is one of the central messages of the Book of Mormon. When we fail to take care of one another, when we fail to bear one another's burdens, when we fail to mourn with each other, to show empathy, to try and help, we will lose as a people and as a nation. We will suffer. And I hear the voice of Mormon pleading to us, don't make the same mistake. This work of inclusion, this work of belonging is central to our covenants as Latter-day Saints. Okay, so there he ends on a high note. I totally agree that the Book of Mormon teaches us empathy, care for one another, helping each other. But does that mean DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion? There's so much to think about here. So to review some of his main points. Number one, iniquity is a major theme of the Book of Mormon, used 222 times. Yep. Number two, iniquity equals unjust behavior or unjust action and inequity. Number three, restricted governance and structural inequality were major reasons for the fall of the Nephite nation. Maybe. Number four, inequity is a major problem today. Quote, don't let us make the same mistake. This work of inclusion, this work of belonging is essential to our covenants as Latter-day Saints, unquote. And number five, I believe the end goal of Dr. Pagan and others in the equity camp is this, to push DEI as a rebellion against current power structures and institutions. On the other side of the aisle, I read and watched the pushback by some LDS apologists. In addition to this apologist article I've been quoting by Eliza Anderson, I also watched two videos on this subject by Thoughtful Faith, one called Is BYU Allowing Activists to Corrupt the Book of Mormon? And the other one, A Neo-Marxist View of the Book of Mormon at BYU. I also watched the video BYU Book of Mormon Fiasco by Cwik Media. All three of these apologists were quick to condemn this talk by Dr. Pagan and were alarmed not only that he would say such things, but that they were allowed to even be said on campus. One guest on Thoughtful Faith even questioned if such talk should be silenced. I don't want to take the time to get their clips from their videos because they were awfully rambling and hard to follow, but I'll try to summarize their main points here. Okay, so the main points of the apologists. Number one, even though iniquity is used a lot in the Book of Mormon, it just means sin. Number two, to quote from the Cougar Chronicle article, quote, the word iniquity cannot possibly be equated with the word inequity, unquote. This piqued my interest. Why can it not possibly be equated when etymologists have clearly shown that iniquity and inequity come from the exact same root word? Number three, the Nephites with their government and church hierarchies were the good guys, and the bad guys, especially the dissenters, according to the Cwik Media video, were the true bad guys. Number four, the Cwik Media also said, inequity is not a problem today as long as we just follow the brethren. And the Cougar Chronicle article said, quote, the Book of Mormon was not brought forth for the end of calling us to remedy the perceived inequities of our day, as Dr. Pagan falsely concludes. Sadly, Dr. Pagan's understanding of the Book of Mormon is skewed because his vision is warped with the modern politics of diversity, equity, and inclusion, unquote. Interesting that Eliza Anderson, quote, knows that the Book of Mormon was not calling us to remedy our iniquities. Like so many apologists and TBMs, I wonder how much she has really even read the Book of Mormon. Okay, number 5. I believe the end goal of these LDS apologists is this: to keep the status quo hierarchies and power structures and to keep down rebellions. So, we have the ideological lines drawn here. And I see these lines as part of a much bigger context, not just a skirmish or a battle, but this is a war, both within the LDS Church and without as part of our broader culture. I want to look at the two opposite sides of the equity issue. And in doing this, I want to be clear that not everyone on each side is orthodox or extreme in their views, and there's a lot of room for nuance. However, throughout my life in the church and my career in education, I have seen so much of both sides that I want to lay them out clearly here. I'll call the one side of the LDS orthodoxy the, quote, LDS status quo, the hierarchy defenders, and the other side, the equity side, the LDS DEI, the equity rebels. And to illustrate the two sides, I'll use a comparison chart. All right, first, on the LDS status quo side. Throughout our church history, the LDS status quo has clearly favored certain groups of people. This favor to certain people, in my view, is exactly what iniquity means: the unequal or uneven treatment of others. Here are some examples of who the LDS status quo has favored. Number 1, whites. The history of our church has clearly favored whites. From the very beginning until about the last 10 years, every prophet, seer, and revelator has been a white European male. And for over 150 years of our church history, about 3/4 of our church's existence, blacks were not only banned from holding the priesthood and any leadership callings, but they were banned from going to the temple, and also it was preached publicly by our prophets and apostles that blacks were eternally cursed because they were less righteous in their preexistence. Even today, a look at the elite seats on the stand at General Conference will show an overwhelmingly whitewashed population. Number 2, the LDS status quo favors males. At no time in the history of our church have women been allowed to hold the priesthood or govern in the church. Every woman in the church is beneath a man, every single one of them. This has permeated every aspect of our culture, from our wards where bishops preside over Relief Society and women, to our homes where we are taught that the man presides over the woman. It's so ingrained in us that in my youth, I saw that whenever an adult male was not present to preside, the women looked to teenage boys with the Aaronic priesthood to preside. Looking back, that feels so ridiculous. And to make matters worse, the temple reinforces this inequality between the genders in both the sealing ceremony, where women are, quote, given to the man to become queens and priestesses, quote, to him, and in the endowment, where for 200 years women had to solemnly swear to obey their husbands and couldn't be allowed to pass through the veil without him admitting them through. Perhaps worst of all is the continuing doctrine of the LDS Church teaches and practices of eternal polygamy, where a man can have an unlimited number of wives in heaven, but a woman can only ever have one eternal husband. Inequality indeed. Number 3, the LDS status quo favors the powerful. I recently spoke to a friend who attends a small Protestant church. He surprised me by saying that when their previous pastor moved away, the congregation formed a committee of its local members that searched for and selected their new pastor. I thought, how bizarre. The members actually have a say in the power structure of their church. The LDS church is the exact opposite. I heard someone say once, "Who are the only people besides Cuba and North Korea that have only one candidate they can vote for at each election? The Mormons." We all are graciously allowed to stand and vote, but we can only vote for the person that the church hierarchy has already selected for us. We have no say and no choice. And once those leaders get into power, no one can remove them but themselves or death. They are unchallenged as they set their hearts upon their high seats, their exclusive meetings, their titles, and their elite privileges. LDS leaders reign supreme. If someone threatens their power or questions them, an apostate or a rival, that person is excommunicated and condemned. They govern as judges, as prophets, as seers, and revelators, as, quote, the elders of Israel. No one is allowed to question their decisions or their policies, lest they, quote, speak evil of the Lord's anointed, unquote. Dictators across the world must envy the kind of power that LDS leaders wield. Number 4, the LDS status quo favors the wealthy. Look around any LDS congregation next Sunday. Do you see a rich person in good standing? Chances are they either are or have been the bishop, the stake president, or a member of the High Council. Do you see a poor man maybe wearing a wrinkled suit and without the latest hairstyle? You can almost guarantee that person is not on the short list for consideration for the next leadership vacancy. For several people that I know and care deeply about, I can predict with certainty that they will never be called as a top leader in the LDS Church because they aren't shiny and luxurious and wealthy and proud enough. It is no coincidence that so many of our general authorities today are doctors, lawyers, judges, and business executives, millionaires. It's no coincidence that they have advanced degrees from the best universities, BYU, Harvard, Oxford. Where are the plumbers? Where are the farm laborers, the humble fishermen among these modern so-called apostles of Jesus? Where are the leaders, as the Book of Mormon says, who, quote, labor with their own hands for their own support, unquote? I previously posted an email I received directing local members in our area to provide Salt Lake with the names of local business owners, civic leaders, community elites to be invited to a special VIP temple open house ceremony, which no poor person could attend. This illustrates perfectly the hierarchy and the values of the LDS Church. It was also no surprise that when our stake recently needed a new stake president, the candidate ultimately chosen by the visiting dignitary from Salt Lake was the only person in our area who owns his own airplane and who brags about it at almost every stake conference. Clearly, the LDS Church values and promotes wealth and the wealthy. So that's the LDS status quo, the hierarchies and the institutional structures as they have stood for almost 200 years. They value and promote whites, males, the rich, and the powerful. Now I want to look at this new challenger, the LDS DEI side, who I think of as equity rebels. DEI is relatively new to the scene in the church and in popular culture. And of course, DEI stands for the current buzzwords diversity, equity, and inclusion. These words sound nice, but to this group, they mean something much different than they do to you and I. In my career in public education, it hasn't been until recently that the movement has really gotten traction, but man, has it gotten traction. I can hardly go to an educational seminar or training without obvious elements of DEI being preached and even required of the attendees. It is probably the loudest drumbeat in public education today, and to some extent in big business and government. And so it was just a matter of time till it got into the church. Even though the label of DEI is new, many of the goals and philosophies are not new, but are as old as the status quo. So looking beyond all the fine words and the nice messages of this current craze, what do the DEI rebels, the equity rebels, really favor? In my experience, in contrast to the status quo, DEI either favors or claims to favor the following. First, non-whites. DEI and its predecessors seek to stir up resentment, victimhood, and rebellion among non-whites. From La Raza movement to Black Lives Matter to pro-Palestinian groups to Native American organizations, DEI seeks to capitalize on the feelings of minorities to encourage rebellion and distrust of the white power status quo. Their success can be seen in protests, boycotts, strikes, and organized rioting. It also can be seen in affirmative action and preferential hiring in government and business. It's not uncommon in public education to see the hiring process skew markedly towards the candidate who either demonstrates or professes a race other than white. In some circles, it is spoken openly that anyone is preferred to old white men. Number 2, the second group favored by DEI are non-males. In the DEI world, males have traditionally held all of the power in society, which is true. But to them, that needs to be torn down. Therefore, women, transgenders, and non-binary individuals are preferred. From changing history textbooks and standardized tests to showcase non-males, to creating media and entertainment that paint non-males as superior, to creating hiring and admission standards that penalize males, the DEI movement attempts to tear down males in business, church, and state. Number 3, DEI also favors the disenfranchised and the out of power. Populist icons for years have capitalized on the feelings of the disenfranchised, from Che Guevara and Cesar Chavez to Pink Floyd and Rage Against the Machine to modern rap and counterculture headliners. Political and social leaders ride these waves of populism, from Robespierre and Adolf Hitler and Karl Marx to many of our modern leaders who promise to help the disempowered while all the time building their own empire and their power. DEI is the modern incarnation of this populism, which capitalizes on the discontent and the hopelessness of the powerless and the disenfranchised. And number 4, DEI claims to favor the poor and the uneducated. In the New Testament, Christ tells his followers that they will always have the poor among them, and that is true of our day. Compared to the wealthy, the poor make up the vast majority of the world's population. At no time in the history of the world has more wealth been concentrated in the hands of so few as there is right now. That's just the truth. And thanks to modern communication and information, everyone knows about it. DEI seeks to focus attention on this disparity, or the gap, in an attempt to tear down the wealth of the wealthy and to take it for their own side. So these DEI targets, the whites, males, the powerful, and the wealthy, are particularly visible in the LDS Church, where they stand out prominently in every visible leadership position. Look on any stand on any Sunday or general conference, and those are the people you see. This fact, I believe, is making the brethren and their apologists in the status quo very nervous, hence the strong reactions against this seminar given by Dr. Pagan. As I look at each side, the status quo and the DEI rebels, in the context of history, I ask myself, what do the two sides represent? What are they fighting for? What is their end goal? And my conclusion is that they are fighting for power. At their extremes, the two sides represent oppression on the one hand and revolution and revenge on the other hand. The status quo needs to repress change and rebellion. It's happy being elite, being in charge, being rich, being powerful. Any upset to that system is a major threat that needs to be put down. The DEI rebellion, on the other hand, needs revolution. It needs to upset the current power and wealth structures. However, history shows us that such rebellions almost always lead to both revenge and a new power structure that in the end looks an awful lot like the old status quo power structure it fought against, just that the new power changes hands. The French Revolution also began with the motto, liberty, equality, and brotherhood, which sounds a lot like DEI, but ended in a reign of terror and a new all-powerful emperor. So, in a similar fashion, DEI today wants to rebel against whites in order to put non-whites in charge. DEI wants to rebel against males in order to put women and non-binaries in charge. And DEI wants to rebel against the powerful, not to do away with power, but to give power to those they favor. And DEI wants to take the wealth of the rich, not to share evenly, but to take for themselves and for their new leaders. Yuck. So those in power and those fighting for power all start to look at the exact same. It's all about being on top, having control, and in the end, being unequal. When things like this don't seem right in this world, as always, I look for understanding in the Book of Mormon. And I believe the Book of Mormon teaches what iniquity truly means. It means treating others unequally or inferior to ourselves. I want to look at some examples of iniquity found in the Book of Mormon that might help illustrate both the status quo, the oppressors, and the DEI rebels, the avengers. First, the status quo. In Alma chapter 4, and thus, in this 8th year of the reign of the judges, there began to be great contentions among the people of the church. Yea, there were envyings and strife, malice, persecutions, and pride, even to exceed the pride of those who did not belong to the church of God. Sounds familiar? And it came to pass in the commencement of the 9th year, Alma saw the wickedness of the church, and he also saw the example of the church began to lead those who were unbelievers on from one piece of iniquity to another, thus bringing on the destruction of the people. Yea, he saw great inequality among the people, some lifting themselves up with their pride, despising others, turning their backs upon the needy and the naked, and those who were hungry, and those who were athirst, and those who were sick and afflicted. In this example, I see a clear example of iniquity and inequality, where the, quote, church began to lead, unquote, the people to pride, despising others and ignoring the poor. To me, this is the heart of iniquity, when we despise others and lift ourselves up in pride. No wonder the LDS Church doesn't want us to know what the true definition of iniquity is. Here's another example, 3 Nephi 6. But it came to pass in the 29th year there began to be some disputations among the people, and some were lifted up unto pride, there it goes again, and boastings because of their exceedingly great riches, yea, even unto great persecutions. For there were many merchants in the land, and also many lawyers and many officers. This sounds like a description of our current general authorities. And the people began to be distinguished by ranks according to their riches and their chances for learning. Yea, some were ignorant because of their poverty, and others did receive great learning because of their riches. And thus there became a great inequality in all the land. And now the cause of this iniquity, inequality equals iniquity. The cause of this iniquity of the people was this: Satan had great power unto the stirring up the people to do all manner of iniquity, and to the puffing them up with pride, tempting them to seek for power and authority and riches and the vain things of the world. So again, iniquity means puffing ourselves up with pride, seeking for power and authority, and seeking for the riches and vain things of the world. And taken to extremes, this iniquity, this valuing of ourselves over others, can lead to plundering and priestcrafts, which means taking from someone else to benefit ourselves, whoredoms, which means gratifying ourselves at the expense of someone else, and even murder, which means valuing our own lives so much more than others that we don't mind taking theirs. I believe all these things, pride, power, despising others, robbing, whoredoms, murder, are all on the exact same continuum of inequality and unequalness, where we value ourselves more than the lives, property, and happiness of others. Now, for an example of the DEI rebels. Speaking of Zarahemnah, the leader of a group who he motivated with speeches of victimhood, disenfranchisement, and revenge, he looked a lot like some DEI leaders and agitators of today. So, Alma. Zarahemnah appointed chief captains over the Lamanites, and they were all Amalekites and Zoramites, who were fellow dissenters and agitators. Now this he did that he might preserve their, the Lamanites, hatred towards the Nephites, that he might bring them into subjection to the accomplishment of his designs. For behold, his designs were to stir up the Lamanites to anger against the Nephites. And this he did that he might usurp great power over them, the Lamanites, and also that he might gain great power over the Nephites by bringing them into bondage. Wow. So, DEI rebels stir up the common people or the disenfranchised in order they may gain power over them and those they're fighting against. Zarahemnah was almost an exact twin of a later leader, Amalekiah. Amalekiah used the same tactics as Zarahemnah and was hugely successful at motivating tens of thousands of Lamanites to go to war against the Nephites and ultimately lose their own lives with his tales of grievances and revenge. And by so doing, Amalekiah usurped not only the power over the Lamanite armies, but he also killed their king and gained the throne, and he got the king's wife for himself. He talked the DEI talk, but those he convinced to follow him were just pawns in his own game of personal power. As Alma says in chapter 49, he, Amalekiah, did not care for the blood of his people. Much like Napoleon of the French Revolution, like George Orwell's pigs in the Animal Farm, and like leaders of rebellions and revolts today, somehow the leaders always end up looking a lot like the same power structure they fought against in the first place. And those useful sheep that get herded along by these rebel leaders, like the Lamanites, in the end, they don't find themselves much more free, more happy, or more prosperous than they were before. So Dr. Pagan was right. The Book of Mormon does talk a lot about iniquity. It gives many excellent examples of pride, wealth, power, discrimination of those who gain power and authority. But what about the antidote to iniquity? Does the Book of Mormon have that? And I believe so. Where Dr. Pagan would prescribe equity as the solution, and the LDS hierarchy would want us to keep the status quo, the true gospel taught in the Book of Mormon teaches neither one. Instead, it teaches true equality as the antidote to iniquity. Here's a couple of examples. In Mosiah 23, and the people were desirous that Alma should be their king, for he was beloved by his people. But he said unto them, Behold, it is not expedient that we should have a king. For thus saith the Lord, Ye shall not esteem one flesh above another, or one man shall not think himself above another. Therefore I say unto you, it is not expedient that ye should have a king. Nevertheless, if it were possible that ye could always have a just men to be your kings, it would be well for you to have a king. But remember the iniquity of King Noah and his priests. And now I say unto you, ye have been oppressed by King Noah, and have been in bondage to him and his priests, and have been brought into iniquity by them. Therefore ye were bound with the bands of iniquity. And now as ye have been delivered by the power of God out of these bonds, yea, even out of the hands of King Noah and his people, and also from the bonds of iniquity, even so I desire that ye should stand fast in this liberty wherewith ye have made free, and that ye trust no man to be a king over you. And thus Alma did teach his people that every man should love his neighbor as himself, that there should be no contention among them. I was very touched recently when I read this chapter. I hadn't remembered all of these words, and it hit me powerfully when I read it again. I thought that, like this people of Alma, I have been delivered out of the bonds of a modern King Noah and his priests. And so when Alma says, as ye have been delivered by the power of God out of these bonds, stand fast in this liberty wherewith ye have been made free, and trust no man to be a king over you. I agree. I feel such a liberty right now in my life. I feel inspired to take care that I don't fall under the power of another king. In addition, this scripture in Helaman teaches the antidote to iniquity, which is equality. First, the words of Jesus Christ himself that Alma quoted, "Thus saith the Lord, ye shall not esteem one flesh above another, or one man shall not think himself above another." I can't say it any clearer than that. The very cure for iniquity and DEI rebellion is to not think of ourselves above another. Poof, just like that. All the wicked practices and hierarchies of the LDS Church, gone. And all the vengeful power grabs of the DEI movement, gone. No one looking for power or advantage or authority over anyone else. Instead, as it says in verse 15, every man should love his neighbor as himself, that there should be no contention among them. Another example of equality, the Book of Mormon's antidote to iniquity, is found in 2 Nephi chapter 26. It says, "For none of these iniquities come of the Lord, for he doeth that which is good among the children of men, and he doeth nothing save it be plain unto the children of men, and he inviteth them all to come unto him and partake of his goodness. And he denieth none that come unto him, black and white, bond and free, male and female, and he remembereth the heathen, and all are alike unto God, both Jew and Gentile." All are alike unto God. And if everyone is alike unto God, why would we behave any differently? Why would we favor whites over blacks, men over women, rich over poor? Why would we lift ourselves or one group of people above others? That is truly iniquity. I've heard detractors of the Book of Mormon complain that God favors the house of Israel. I would invite anyone who are watching this video to consider this scripture. To God, all are alike, both Jew and Gentile. He doesn't play favorites, and I don't believe that I should either. The final example I want to look at of the teachings of equality in the Book of Mormon comes from Christ's visit to the Lehites. In 35:14, he tells them, just as he taught the Jews in Jerusalem, quote, "Therefore, all things whatsoever ye would that men should do to you, do ye even so to them, for this is the law and the prophets." This simple one-sentence summary of all of the law and the prophets is the key to understanding iniquity and equality. Listen up, apologists. Listen up, rebels. It's right there. If there is ever a question of something being wrong, I just have to ask, would I want someone else to do this to me or my loved ones? And that answers it. Do I want someone to lift themselves up in pride over me or my loved ones? No, so I shouldn't either. Do I want someone to consider themselves better than me because of their race, gender, wealth, or status? No, so I shouldn't either. Do I want someone to plunder, commit whoredoms, or murder my loved ones? No, then I shouldn't do those things either. Do I want someone to exert authority and power over me or my loved ones? No, then I shouldn't exert them either. By living this simple law taught by Jesus Christ, the Lehites in 4th Nephi had pure equality and peace. At the end of the day, the message of the Book of Mormon is simple. 1, believe in Christ and in his teachings. 2, repent of the things I'm doing wrong and that don't match his teachings. And 3, follow him in his example and try to be like him as he loves and serves everyone equally. What else really matters?